I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Litman, and this is Battleground. I am still flying solo this week because Faz is spending time with his very cute new baby. My guest this week was Brian Fallon, the co-founder and executive director of Demand Justice.
If we don't get our act together and fight for the future direction of the courts, we stand to lose a lot.
Brian Fallon, welcome to Battleground.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Give me the TLDR. What does Demand Justice do, for those who aren't familiar with it?
So we are a group that is trying to get progressive activists to understand that the courts are an important arena for us to try to influence politically. And it is not an issue that is on the tip of the tongue of most progressive activists or even most progressive voters. And as a result, we've been getting our butts kicked for the last 30 years on this issue. And we are trying to sort of shake up how Democrats approach the courts. During the years that Trump was in office, we organized a lot of volunteers and spent a lot of money on ads and trying to stop some of Donald Trump's worst nominees. But as much as we focus on trying to contest what Republicans are doing in terms of the people that they put on the courts, we're also trying to create a bit of a shakeup in the Democratic Party in terms of how we approach judges in the courts. It's mostly taking our cues from progressive legal elites that have been telling progressive activists that the courts are an issue that has to remain apolitical and that should not be the subject of democratic activism. I think that's all wrong. I think conservatives have been organizing around the courts for a long time. They've been committing activist energy to this issue. They've been making it an issue that they wage campaigns around and that their candidates speak to during the course of their candidacies. I think our side needs to develop those muscles too. And so we're trying to challenge old school institutionalist, normsy democratic thinking as much as we're trying to contest what Republicans and Mitch McConnell are doing. And we're having some success. And the Biden administration, thankfully, in the person of Ron Klain, who's their chief of staff, sees things in a very different way than previous Democratic administrations. And so we're seeing new types of people being nominated by President Biden to the courts. And so that's encouraging, but in a different respect in terms of, we believe that there's some big picture structural changes needed to undo the damage that Republicans have done to the courts. We're still encountering a lot of institutionalist minded thinking, even from the Biden administration. So we're trying to work from the ground up of building awareness among Democratic activists and recruiting volunteers and convincing Democratic lawmakers that this is an issue that they need to be prepared to think boldly about.
You talk about going up against institutions and establishment Democrats. Up until 3 to 4 years ago, you would have probably characterized yourself as one of those. You worked for Schumer, you worked for the DOJ. Was there a moment that was radicalizing for you?
Well, I think in the aftermath of 2016, there were a lot of people in our party that started to see the world differently and started to think that the old way of approaching politics was just not going to meet the moment. And I think that the party is slowly but surely adjusting itself to that new reality. And you see it playing out in across issues beyond just the one that I'm directly involved in, which is judges in the courts. But I think if you asked myself or a lot of Democrats 5 or 7 years ago about the idea of growing the number of states, and we should get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, and we should seriously reconsider the Electoral College, that these were all ideas that people might have thought were a little pie in the sky 5 to 7 years ago. And slowly but surely, but especially in the last couple of years, we've come to see these as not just, pie in the sky ideas. These are absolutely critical reforms that are needed to restore democracy in this country. And so I think that what the types of things that we're calling for doing with respect to judges and the courts, I think fits right alongside those other ideas that might have 4 or 5 years ago seemed like something that was wishful thinking and not politically viable, but that Democrats have come to realize is something that we need to convince our party to embrace, and that we will never sort of fulfill our hopes for the country as a true multiracial democracy unless we get some of these ideas mainstreamed and enacted.
Can you describe a little bit the Republican infrastructure around courts?
It's a great question, a great way of putting it. All of this infrastructure that was created is the result of decades of planning and investment by well-funded, deep-pocketed interests that aligned around basically two issues: corporate interests and issues concerning religious issues, the evangelical movement. And those two sort of issues and those two sets of donors that are motivated by those issues have really propelled this movement such that an organization like the Federalist Society is, funded probably 10 or 20 to 1 compared to its left-wing analog, the American Constitution Society.
Mhm.
And, I know that you encounter these funding disparities all the time when you're trying to convince Democratic donors to consider giving to down ballot races and investing in long-term infrastructure versus giving to the trendy Senate candidate of any given election cycle. A lot of reporters and even staffers on Capitol Hill would come to me during the Kavanaugh fight and during Ruth Bader Ginsburg's the subsequent battle over her seat, and they would say, "Hey, even if this doesn't go your way, you're probably raising all kinds of money off of this, right?" And I was like, "No, you know why? Because Chuck Schumer doesn't tell big Democratic donors in New York and California to give to groups like mine that are trying to plan for the long term.
Nope.
They say like, hey, if you're upset about this, give to our Senate candidate so we can flip the Senate." And that's almost as far as any of these donors think in terms of the next federal election cycle.
I do think it's worth noting, though, the two issues that you pointed out of corporate interest and evangelical, which tends to embody itself most often in abortion and women's right to choose. Do you think there's something specific about that draws out sort of the conservative, both I think conservative donors, but also conservative voters that we don't have on our side in terms of the way our voters think about the courts?
Yeah, it's sort of an unholy marriage that exists on the right. It's obviously business interests and corporate America's goals that are fueling a large part of the cash infusion and the engagement from elites on the Republican
Mhm.
side. But that's not a huge, oh, we need to overturn Chevron deference so
Yeah,
that
voters
the
don't give a
EPA
shit. Yeah.
can't regulate greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
That's not really a thing that galvanizes rank and file voters on the Republican side. They tend to whip their voters up into a frenzy by talking about abortion and reaching evangelical audiences that way. And the other issue that we haven't talked about is guns and the fear that the next Democratic president is going to take your guns away, and a Supreme Court that consisted of a majority of Democratic appointees would overturn Heller and end the individual right to bear arms. And so guns and abortion are the two rallying cries that truly mobilize the conservative grassroots. But what is funding that network and that infrastructure? What's funding Americans for Prosperity and all the in-state organizing that the Koch brothers do? It's corporate America business-backed dollars fused with organic enthusiasm amongst conservative rank and file voters around the issue of guns and abortion.
Let's talk about abortion, because it does seem like Roe v. Wade is on the chopping block. And part of that has been the intended goal of the Republican broader ecosystems investment in state legislatures to pass the, overreaching bills that then get in front of the Supreme Court. Is there anything we can do to save abortion access in America? Are we super screwed?
Well, I think that there is something that we can do. And to me, the question is just whether we will truly summon the will to do what it's going to take. You're already hearing calls from some corners that the solution here is to codify Roe v. Wade and give it the force of federal law and try to head the Supreme Court off at the pass that way. And of course, I would totally support that effort. It's going to take, I think, getting rid of the filibuster to do it. And we all know where that stands right now.
Yeah.
But make no mistake, if we were to pass a law like that, it would end up right back in front of these same justices. And so to me, it's a short-term solution at best. And this is true across issues. I say the same thing in the context of the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act. Should we pass it? Absolutely. Should we content ourselves that just passing that would be sufficient? Absolutely not, because the Supreme Court will gut the next Voting Rights Act just like they gutted the original one in 1965. So on any of these issues, whether it's gun safety or abortion rights or voting rights, you need to have a legislative solution that directly addresses the issue at hand, but you need a sidecar strategy for dealing with the court. And so to me, having a strategy for reforming the court is as necessary as getting rid of the filibuster to address any of these issues. Just like you need to be able to get through the Senate, and you're going to need to get rid of the filibuster to pass something like codifying Roe or to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, you're also going to need a Supreme Court reform strategy so that whatever, after going through all that trouble, winning the trifecta, winning those Georgia seats, getting Sinema and Manchin to go along with getting rid of the filibuster to pass these, we're going to come back in 3 years and have the Supreme Court undo them all. That's the fate that we're in store for unless we have a court strategy alongside these other ideas. Whether you're a progressive justice or conservative justice or moderate justice, the founders didn't anticipate people living this long. They weren't anticipating that justices were going to be on the court for 30, 40 years.
So give me your wish list. What's the court reform dream?
Well, so Joe Biden now has a court reform commission going on, which is, a very frustrating endeavor because he's mostly selected academic scholars to serve on it. And they don't have any mandate to make any formal recommendations to Biden about particular solutions. So in terms of actually producing something that's going to be actionable, there's no hope of that. We sort of have an all of the above strategy for ideas to reform the court. And among the ideas that we support are term limits for justices,
Love
to
it.
regularize the appointment schedule so that we're not in a situation where our vacancies just arise by happenstance due to either a justice strategically timing their retirement or the arbitrariness of when they fall ill and pass, but rather standardize a schedule where, for instance, you could say that future justices are appointed to 18-year terms on the Supreme Court, and a vacancy will arise every 2 years. That guarantees that every president in any given 4-year term is going to get the chance to nominate 2 people. And even if a vacancy arises through an untimely death, if the president has already picked 2 people in their 4-year window, they don't get to pick a third. It carries over into the next window. And it sort of reduces the ability for people like Mitch McConnell to game the system by trying to hold seats open or manipulate the timing of when seats come open.
Yeah.
So that's one reform that has actually a great deal of support from bipartisan sources. Even John Roberts, before he was on the court, supported term limits for Supreme Court justices. So that's something that I hope will not prove too controversial over time. I don't think it's something that's going to happen tomorrow, but I think that's like a near-term possibility for where consensus could be had.
Just a question on that. That has to come from Congress, or is this a change that Joe Biden can just like wave a magic wand and institute?
Yeah, it would require statutory change passed by Congress. But the good news is that it could be done through a statutory change. If this proposal gains steam, a lot of people will come out of the woodwork and try to say that it needs a constitutional amendment. There's a very strong case that's been embraced by a lot of academics on both sides of the aisle that you could do it through simple statute. And the reason is because the Constitution does guarantee life tenure for federal judges, but it doesn't guarantee that they get to serve for life on any particular court. So you could do a proposal like that through simple act of legislation. So that's number one. Number two is adding seats to the court. Specifically, there's been a bill introduced in Congress, and it would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. And this was a proposal that was started to be talked about after Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, but then really took hold after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died and Republicans pulled out the stops to install Amy Coney Barrett while people were already voting in the election. And so it's now up to 28 sponsors in the House, growing every week. There's a historical basis for doing this. Congress has changed the court size 7 times. It hasn't happened in a while, but it was routine all during the early part of the nation's history. Changed 3 times in the 1860s, which is a period of tumult and dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War and what notions of who should vote and who should participate in our democracy that are not unlike the questions that we're encountering today. And it could be done by simple act of legislation. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. Constitution left it up to Congress to decide how many sit on there. And the last thing I'll say on this is, for the first 100 plus years in the nation's history, it wasn't an arbitrary number of how many justices served in the Supreme Court. It was based on how many different circuit courts we had in the United States of America. And since the court size was set at 9, we've since grown by 4 in terms of the number of circuit courts in America, but we've never had the number of justices on the Supreme Court catch up to that.
You mentioned 2 Supreme Court justices by name, and I want to take them one at a time. Justice Breyer, it's very old. It's very, very old. How do we get this old man to retire and give Joe Biden a vacancy? It's an uncomfortable topic of conversation, I think, a little bit, because it's, how do you get someone who has a right, at least for now, to this job for life, to opt out of what is a pretty sweet gig?
Yeah, so at age 82, he is the court's oldest justice. And you would have thought that after seeing what befell Justice Ginsburg, who stayed on the court, and despite multiple bouts with cancer, because she really lived for the job, and seeing how that ended, you would have thought that there'd be a sense of caution on the part of Justice Breyer, but we've not seen any evidence of that. He just gave an interview last week to CNN and explained that, he really loves the job and how disinclined he was to retire. And to me, it just throws a spotlight on how broken the system is, that the future trajectory of the court and the implications that that has for millions of people that will have to live with the court's rulings in the coming years is all hanging on the ego of an 82-year-old justice who, is enjoying being the senior most liberal. That's why I think we need reforms, not just adding seats, but these justices are just too powerful.
Yeah.
If they're, whether you're a progressive justice or conservative justice or moderate justice, the founders didn't anticipate people living this long. They weren't anticipating that justices were going to be on the court for 30, 40 years. One of 9 justices that are increasingly making decisions that Congress has just forfeited the opportunity to make because Congress has become so dysfunctional. Mitch McConnell literally is going around promising that he won't fill a seat for Joe Biden if he's the Senate Majority Leader in 2023. So I think that Breyer generationally just represents an outdated type of thinking where he can't possibly appreciate the stakes of the moment that we're in politically.
Let's talk a little bit about Brett Kavanaugh. Earlier this week, a story dropped about how during the great FBI investigation into his sexual assault, the FBI just sent the tips that they were getting over to Trump's lawyers. Is that normal? I've never worked in the Justice Department. I'm not a lawyer. Is that normal process? And more broadly, is Brett Kavanaugh a legitimate Supreme Court justice? Do you have a viewpoint on this?
The revelation that came to light this week was good to have because it was an official admission from the FBI that the investigation that they did into the claims against Brett Kavanaugh was a sham investigation. Of course, we all knew that at the time. Yeah. And it was sort of twofold. There was 2 revelations or confirmations of things that we long suspected in that letter. One was that there were all manner of people that had pertinent information that they never interviewed because they were limited to interviewing only a list of 10 people that the White House specifically signed off on. And the second thing was that they had set up this tip line, which at the time people viewed skeptically, are you really going to pursue any of these legitimate tips that you might unearth by setting up this tip line? And lo and behold, in the letter this week, they admitted that they did have some relevant tips that emerged from the tip line. And their manner of dealing with them was to give them to the White House counsel's office, which of course promptly shoved them into a drawer, never to be acted on, because they were interested in confirming Brett Kavanaugh above all else, not actually learning what happened. And so to me, it confirms, to answer your question directly, it confirms that Brett Kavanaugh does not belong on the Supreme Court. And so long as he's one of the 9, we should not view that body as a legitimate institution in its current makeup. But number 2, it sort of begs the question to me, all right, Democrats were powerless in 2018 when this was happening. We didn't have, the Republicans were in the majority in the Senate, but we also didn't control the House yet. We hadn't won back the House. And so there was no oversight function that could be performed on the House side either. Now, of course, we have the gavels in both chambers. So having been in receipt of this information now from the FBI, there is nothing to stop either Dick Durbin as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee or Jerry Nadler, the head of the House Judiciary Committee, or any of the oversight committees from deciding, we're going to pursue the unfinished business here from 2018, and we're going to interview those people that the FBI should have interviewed at the time. And we're going to seek the documents that the White House refused to turn over. And we're going to ask you for those tips that you gave to Don McGahn to light on fire. And we're going to conduct our own investigation. To what end? Well, there's a very credible basis to believe that Brett Kavanaugh committed perjury on multiple different issues. If they could prove perjury, you could do any number of things at that point. You can make a referral to the Justice Department to reopen a criminal investigation, or more likely, more straightforwardly, Congress could itself embark on impeachment proceedings. And now, when you start to talk about some of these things, some people say do you really want the Senate at a time where it needs to be passing infrastructure and the voting rights bill to be bogged down in an impeachment trial? And do you think you get to 67 votes anyway? And I have a couple reactions to that. One is actually, yes, this is important. He's got a lifetime appointment, and we now have confirmation that he skated on all these credible allegations. So yeah. But number 2, even if you don't think you could get Republicans to cross the aisle on impeaching him at the end of the day, it is still worth doing. We're going to be living with Brett Kavanaugh's decisions for the next 30 years. Like, we ought to have all the facts about him, and the public ought to know how seriously and legitimately it should view the Supreme Court as an institution. So I think there's value in pursuing this, even if it doesn't succeed in getting, the likes of Mitch McConnell to vote for impeachment at the end of the day. We're going to be dealing with Trump's legacy for the next 30 to 40 years in the form of these very young judges that he put on the bench that, share his vision of the country.
We talked a lot about the Supreme Court. I want to talk about the rest of the judiciary. One of the most alarming stats that I think about, once a week, is that Trump appointed 1/5 of the federal judiciary. We will feel the impact of Trump's decision-making long after he is out of the news cycle. What is the remedy for that?
So you're absolutely right that this is a problem. We were saying while Trump was still in office that long after we succeed in ousting Trump, we're going to be dealing with Trump's legacy for the next 30 to 40 years in the form of these very young judges that he put on the bench that share his vision of the country. And we're already seeing that in the first 6 months of Joe Biden's presidency, because the way that the federal courts work, if you are a conservative activist organization and you don't like something that Joe Biden's doing, you can go jurisdiction shopping and literally file a lawsuit in a place that has, a majority of Republican appointed judges, and get a lower court judge to rule against a national policy that Biden may be seeking to implement by executive order. So you're seeing rulings at the lower courts in the last few months trying to stop the eviction moratorium that the Biden administration tried to continue in light of COVID and people being displaced. There was a ruling just a couple of weeks ago in South Carolina about, it's unconstitutional to try to limit handgun purchases to people that are 21 and above. You should have to sell them to people that are as young as 18. And there's going to continue to be challenges to Biden executive orders that are going to meet with unfriendly Trump-appointed judges in the lower courts. And then when they work their way up the system, ultimately going to have to get by a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. And so it's super important that the Biden administration takes seriously the need to appoint its own people, its own judges to the lower court vacancies when they arise. And so far, the good news is, while the Biden administration is fairly circumspect when it comes to any of the legislative reform proposals we were talking about a minute ago. Ron Klain, God love him, does appreciate the need to appoint judges and appoint them quickly. And so they are actually setting records. They're at a faster clip nominating judges for the lower courts than any president since Richard Nixon.
I know we're running short on time, so I want to end with a final question, sort of loops back to where we started in talking about the point of demand progress, which you created in part to pressure for court reform, but also to create what I think I've heard you say before, Supreme Court voters, people who engage in this process because they are fired up about the Supreme Court. They have them on the right. It's we talked about abortion and guns. Do you feel we're making progress on that front among the Democratic sort of voting base and activists?
Slowly but surely, yes. So in 2016, as you know, Donald Trump campaigned on the Supreme Court, released a list of people he would appoint if he won. And I remember being in a couple communications meetings where Hillary Clinton did devote a day on the trail to talking about the court and gave a speech on it. And we just didn't feel like it landed. So we quickly moved away from it, never talked about it again. And we were right at that time. There was, think of what was happening at the time. Merrick Garland was being blocked. And a lot of rank and file Democratic voters were just sort of greeting that situation passively. And there's reason to believe that's changing, because in 2020, in exit polls that came out after the election, Joe Biden won voters that said that the Supreme Court was a top priority for them as compared to Donald Trump, which was a complete flip from 2016 when Donald Trump won voters that said that the Supreme Court was a top issue for them. And I think that the progress is coming because of incidents like the Brett Kavanaugh fiasco and because of the untimely death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what Republicans did after that. And I think what those situations have forced us as Democrats to unlearn is this sort of feeling that the courts are apolitical and that we have to sort of leave them alone and just hope for the best. And that is not the approach that Republicans have ever taken, as we talked about at the start of the interview. But for us, that is to say, for Democrats who cherish institutions, who believe in government as a noble thing, the idea of sort of politically organizing around the courts strikes us as a little bit uncouth and a little bit as something that should be outside the scope of politics. And so it's taking us some real political near-death experiences to sort of figure out that if we don't get our act together and fight for the future direction of the courts, we stand to lose a lot. And so I do think things are going to get worse before they get better. We're going to start to experience the reality of some of the bad rulings from the 6-3 court. But I think over time, the real traumatizing experiences of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation and Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, combined with the consequences in the form of rulings that might come as soon as next term on cases like abortion and gun safety, that I think is going to shock your average Democratic activist into realizing that this is an issue that we need to put at the center of a progressive agenda.
Brian Fallon, Executive Director of Demand Progress, thank you for joining us on Battleground. Joining me, I guess. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.